in particular, I'm excited to be of this track, Inspired to be Inspired, because I feel like that's really what my journey is about as a designer. It's all about inspiration. And my talk is titled Of Places and Pixels, 3 Learnings from My Design Journey. And I want to sort of like go through 3 learnings that I've had throughout my career journey. And I don't just want to talk about what is it about, what is the learning, but also talk about how I got there, but also how I apply these learnings today at Mapbox. And these learnings kind of span all the stages of my career. So I started off in architecture, I went into research, and now I'm in map design. And this is also why there's the main title of the talk, which is Of Places and Pixels, because places and pixels are really sort of the key thing that have sort of like shaped my career throughout, from the very beginning to now. If you go to the next slide, this idea of interdisciplinarity, pixels and places and pixels is so important to me and so important to my personal journey, because it's really different and also non-tech disciplines that have taught me how to be a better designer in tech. And why do I want to talk about this? I think this is really important because if you go to the next slide, I want to show how you can make your non-tech background relevant to a position in tech. So I myself have faced a situation at some point in my life where I made this transition, and I want to show you how you can sort of take these experiences from sort of like a previous life and make them relevant for your job in technology. And the other thing why I want to talk about these learnings is because I want to sort of demystify the design profession a bit and sort of go beyond the UI mock-up and talk more about like the values and paradigms that we have in design and technology. So the very first learning that I want to share with you is from my architecture phase of life. So I have to say, I'm quite unqualified to build a building today. I never actually worked as an architect, but I did learn something there, which is thinking in design systems. So at the early stages of my career, I never actually built a building, but what I did build a lot is I built a lot of architectural models. And you can think of the architectural model sort of like a miniature building, right? That works very similar to an actual building. And this is also why architects tend to make designs or architectural models so that they can sort of like verify their designs before they push it to production, so to speak. What you see here is an architectural model, so I want to illustrate the process of building an architectural model for you, tie it back to the learning at the end. But what you see here is actually a photo, so it's not a Photoshop image, it's not a rendering, it's an actual cardboard model. So it's a library, it's about 2 arms lengths long, physical model, and you can see here, there are very different components, right? You have like a little stairs in the background, you have tables, you have slabs, and what's really important about these models is all about precision. So, the window has to fit into the wall has to fit into the floor slab has to align with the facade. So it's really important that you have a good mechanism of building this highly, highly dependent system that you have here. And like any system, there are sort of like smarter ways and less smart ways to set this up, and I want to show you how this works in practice. So what you see here is the model before. It's a 3D model. It's actually sort of these cardboard sheets, and then you have all the little parts in there that the laser cutter, so we're not actually cutting those out by hand, we're kind of like laser cutting these to sort of like have them assembled later. And what you see on the right hand side is sort of an overarching component, so it's these pieces coming together to a part of the actual building that you're building. And like any system, when you sort of design the individual piece, you also have to think about sort of the overarching model you're building, right? You cannot get lost in details, but you still have to make sure the details are right, so they'll actually sort of like fit together. I think the other characteristic about the system, if you go to the next slide, is that you have to assemble it somehow, right? And you can think of this sort of like as an IKEA piece of furniture. You know how you never actually have to measure anything, right? You don't need a ruler, because IKEA sets up the system for you that allows you to put your piece of furniture together. It's the same here. We kind of leverage precision of the laser cutter to make the system as easily as possibly to assemble it by humans. And what you see on the right-hand side here is the model it actually looked like. So it's really designed just for this very small photo that you're taking of it. Looks really scrappy on the outside. So, you know, why do I show you this, right? So first of all, I want to say, you know, there's a reason why we talk about architecture and software development. It is architecture, and it's very similar in many ways. And in fact, I want to claim that, you know, all systems are somewhat the same. So they consist of individual features, and these features are grouped into components. That's one aspect. But then also an error in one part of the system, it can affect other parts. And then the last thing, and I think that's really the most important part about systems which stab them, it requires high and low level thinking. And I want to sort of like fast forward to my role at Mapbox now. So I'm still working with systems, and you probably may have wondered, you know, what does a map designer do? This is exactly what I do. I build web maps, so I'm sure you've all seen a web map before. But this isn't just a web map. This is actually our browser tool. It's called Mapbox Studio. And the Mapbox Studio allows you, or anyone really, to create maps and sort of like tweaking things. And what we give you is, we give you sort of a system. So again, like, think of it as essentially a component. For example, say you have a street network that consists of pedestrian walkways, consists of tunnels, bridges, highways, and so on. And we give you a logic that sort of like puts these together as a component and lets you style them together, kind of like an IKEA system for maps, essentially. Yeah, I can assure you, if you do make an error in one part of the application, it will 100% trigger an error elsewhere. So again, like very similar in a sense. I think the most important part about like web maps, if we go one slide further, is the ability or the importance of thinking high and low level. So as a map designer, you both have to think about, you know, how do I treat this point of interest, how to like style it in great detail and with a lot of care, but then also have to think about the high level, right? So all the way from the globe down to the next level, to the street levels. If you continue further, you should sort of like see all the levels of a map. And if you go further, you're basically at street level, right? So you have to think of the map as sort of this holistic product. It has to work on every zoom level and sort of be a consistent experience. You know, of course, there are differences too between architectural models and web maps. So if you go to the next slide right here, you know, buildings have maybe 5 to 10 to maybe 1,000 users, but we have 600 million monthly active users on our web mapping platform. They're from different industries, so you see some industries right here. And I think the more interesting part about, you know, software is it's not static, right? So if you get user feedback, you're able to refactor and sort of like expand your system as you go and sort of like build on that user feedback that you get. So that's something I very much enjoy about, you know, software architecture, so to speak. So I guess you can already see I talk about design quite freely here. So it isn't really about designing an icon or picking a color palette. It's really about something more fundamental. And this is also sort of where my next learning is coming in that I want to share with you. And it's titled, Design Isn't About Beauty, It's About Solving Relevant Problems. I think there's this idea in our heads, and it's also in the heads of designers, that design is first and foremost about building something beautiful. But in reality, it's not about that, right? It's about solving relevant problems for people, you know, that people are facing out there. And I want to say that the actual designing of the solution is only about 20% of that whole design process, really. So it's a very small part. And I'm actually quoting John Maeda here. I don't know if you've heard of him. He's a very influential design and tech personality. So he said that. So this is sort of like implicit knowledge. We kind of know this as a designer, but I think you really have to experience in order to learn this particular learning. And I personally learned this when researching urban environments. So I went all over the world. I went to Russia, I went to Colombia, I went to Senegal, and I looked at urban environments. And there's this one project in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, which I particularly enjoy, which was about finding or designing solutions for the problem of jaywalking. So, jaywalking is pretty common all over the world. I may have done it, you may have done it, so not saying anything here, but the one thing that's different about the situation is that people actually jaywalk on highways. So it's pretty dangerous, vehicles come at really high speed, and they do so despite there's actually an option to take an overpass nearby. So we collaborated with local researchers in Addis, and we wanted to understand why people do that. Why would people risk their lives? The problem there was that we didn't really have much information about, the why. We didn't have any data on the stakeholders or in the urban environment. So if you go to the next slide, a really big part of this whole research was like trying to figure out the why, right? So we collected a lot of information. We made all these scrappy drawings about like infrastructure, movements in space, like the urban environment. But I think like one key learning actually came from a different source, and it came from interviewing pedestrians that were about to cross. And we were particularly curious to understand like why people wouldn't take the overpass if it's there. And I think if you go to the next slide right here, what we learned is by asking people is that the perceived time to cross taking the overpass, it was perceived as longer as it actually took people to take the overpass. So what you see here in green is what people told us they think how much it takes them, and then what you see in purple is how much time it actually took them. And we realized that people's perception of the level of effort plays a really big role in their decision making. And our thought was, okay, we can't really shorten the actual time, right? Because jaywalking will be the fastest no matter what. So is there a way for us to shorten the perceived amount of time? And that's exactly where our solution tapped in. So this is just, again, like a pretty scrappy sketch, but this is the overpass, and you can see how we thought about, can we make this more attractive? Can we put like street vendors up there and maybe shading so that people can not just, have to cross the overpass, but they can sort of like combine it with something useful, something they need to do anyways, and sort of like shorten that perceived amount of time. So this is an example of a process where the solution was, maybe 20%, even less. So it was really much more about figuring out who the stakeholders are, why they were doing what they were doing, and then, what their needs were in this whole process. So this question comes up constantly, like, tell me why. Like, why are we doing this? This is an awesome new feature that we have at Mapbox. Like, we nerd out about it, we love it. But why do we need it? Why does the customer need it? What problem does it solve? And I thought this meme was quite fitting. So for those who remember the Backstreet Boys, I think, I don't want to quote them, but they had a point, I want to give you another example from my job today, and it's also a navigation-related example, and it's actually sort of like flipping the perspective. So it's looking at the driver and their navigation behavior. So what you see here is a navigation map, and it's actually a map by our customer GM. So this is their in-vehicle navigation system. And what's really important with web maps in a navigation context is they have to be, very tailored. We really want to focus on the user needs, which is getting from A to B efficiently, but also safely. So if you have cluttered information on there, information that isn't relevant, it can not only be a pain in the ass, it's also potentially dangerous, right? Because it could lead to driver distraction and accidents. And I want to show you just one small example of things that your navigation map may do without you even knowing. It's an example of sort of like very targeted design, which is sort of a dynamic behavior in your map. So, if you ever use a navigation app, you can sort of like think of your journey into these 4 stages. So you start with exploration. You're trying to figure out where you're going. You're trying to get a sense of where you are. And there you might be, interested in all kinds of points of interest. So you might be interested in landmarks or parks. So you want to see more context about where you're going. Once you, go to the next step, you might want to like search for a specific category. So maybe you're searching for a coffee shop. In this case, you might only want to see coffee shops, so your map sort of adapts and only shows you these points of interest. And then you go into your guidance mode, so you're actually en route to your target destination, and there you're really interested in seeing where you go. It was everywhere, so that kind of inspired me to pursue another degree in data science. And I think the more important part, though, is that I sort of relentlessly worked on projects where I could leverage and build up my coding and data analysis skills. And I did so as my day job and consultant. I always look for these opportunities, but I also tried to do this in my after work job as a freelance information designer. And I think the more projects I did, the more I realized that, having these tools and knowing these tools is great, but it still comes down to the storytelling, like the story you want to tell with your data. And I want to show you one project that may have sort of been the starting point for me to sort of on this like storytelling journey with data. And it actually uses a specific type of data. It uses my own data. So what you see here is location data. And if you have a Google account, you probably know that there's this thing called location history, right? So this is a while ago. Back then it looked like this. You had this dashboard and you had all these dots on a map indicating the locations you were at. But it's not very interesting, right? It's not very creative. It's just dots on a map. So the data itself didn't really tell a story. So I was thinking, how can I turn this into something more insightful, or how can I make a story out of this? And if you can get your hands on that data, what you'll see is that the data actually has timestamps attached to it. So that allows you to sort of connect them to a continuous journey. But there's also information about the modes of transportation, because you have to time both the distance, right? You can make some assumption what mode of transportation you might have taken at a place and time. And this is actually exactly what you can see here. So it's this interactive experience, sort of like connecting all these dots that I've sort of, all the places I've been into one continuous journey, and sort of like drawing the path, and it allows me to sort of like re-experience my journey at each point in time, and gives me some information about the mode of transport and the overall distance as well. This is one example of what you can do with something as simple as location data. And sort of like summing up, let's see, there should be one more slide. Yeah, here we go. Sort of summing up my learning here, I think, there are multiple factors that influence the outcome of a data visualization. So on one hand, it's things like what your data looks like, and this is maybe something you can't necessarily influence. But then there are other parts, like how you process or aggregate the data, how you treat null values, things like that, where you make a lot of deliberate choices about what you want the data to look like. And then most importantly, it's also about how you choose to visualize it. So the visualization type that you choose matters a lot to the story that you're trying to tell. And I want to show you one more project that's kind of somewhat similar. And what's different here is that the source of data is very different. And it's sort of an unusual type of data. It's actually textual data. So what you can see here is a Latin text, and it's actually the travel diary of a guy named Albrecht von Haller. So he was a famous physician and botanist, and I kind of like came across him by chance, because it turns out he was sort of like one of the first tourists of the region where I'm from. So I'm from Switzerland, kind of somewhere in the center, and he apparently was the first tourist. So I was really intrigued by that idea, and I wanted to see sort of how he experienced the landscape and the culture back in the 18th century when he lived. And at the same time, this was also when Mapbox had launched a couple of really exciting new features, and it was also an opportunity for me to sort of like, test out some storytelling and see what I could do with these features. And what I did is I took this text, not the Latin one, to be fair, I had a translation, and I sort of like tried to map the data to an actual map, so I could actually figure out where he was going, and then I could take this route line that I developed and sort of like attach his experiences he had at each point of the journey. And what you can see here is sort of the intro page. So this is a typical story map. You might have heard this term. It's a form of data visualizations. So there's like this intro page here where you get a bit of information about him, and an image sort of like with the setting, and then this is sort of the main body of the experience. And you kind of, as a user, you're scrolling and you're sort of advancing the journey as you're scrolling down, and you get some side information about what he saw at each point, like how many species, for example, he saw plant species, he's really interested in plant species. And that way you sort of like, you know, essentially get a visual experience from something as sort of unvisual as a Latin text. And this is just one way of how you can sort of, take your data and create this interactive experience from it. So, sort of, wrapping up, one really important part to just mention storytelling, but again, like I want to emphasize, for me as a designer, the importance of thinking in design systems, really important in my day-to-day job. Learning number 2, design isn't about beauty, it's about solving relevant problems. Again, something that I think is very important as a designer in any technology field. And then the last part, for me as a map designer, you make the story, you make the data come alive. It's your story that you project onto the data, not the other way around. So that's the last learning here. And I want to close by saying, I want to continue learning. I'm not done. I'm very much an apprentice. And sometimes there are phases where you might feel uninspired, or you're not sure how you can get the next learning. And I want to say, go and embrace messiness. For me, inspiration came from architecture, which seems somewhat irrelevant in text context, but it may come from the unexpected. You can find inspiration everywhere. So if you want to go and cultivate that beehive, go and do it. There's always something you could take from it. There's always something you can project onto your personal career. So thank you very much. I'm really excited to hear from your learnings, hear about your personal trajectory. If you're interested in mappy stuff, feel free to follow me. I every once in a while post something about maps at Mapbox. So love to see you there. Thank you very much.